yes, before you ask, it is Chihuahua nap time. So you are going to hear her snoring in the background. Now, today's video, I came across an interesting channel, which is a guy who, it appears that he lives in the US, but he's from Britain. And this particular video that I'm looking at today is him doing a comparison between road trips in Britain and road trips in the US. And I thought that would be a really interesting thing to look at from an Australian perspective. So, which are we more like in Australia? And where are things different, I guess? So, let's jump in and see the difference between the US and the UK in terms of road trips. And I'm going to just add my own thoughts along the way.
Hello, my wife and I recently got back from a visit to West Virginia, and on that trip it got me thinking, how do road trips compare between my homeland of Britain and the United States? And with America being the land of car culture and Britain that of public transit, Americans might be thinking, is a British road trip even a thing? And yes, it is, but in my experience of doing road trips in both countries, it's a very different thing. And here are 5 ways that British and American road trips are very different. Now, you can't really compare and contrast road trips in the United States with road trips in Britain without talking about the distance involved. So when we drove from Chicago to West Virginia, it was something like 400 miles. And if you were to take that distance as a percentage of the distance from the East Coast to the West Coast, it's not that much. However, if you were to do the same thing in Britain, you would end up in the sea. The point is, everyone knows at this point, America much larger than Britain.
So, from Bendigo, 7 hours driving would well and truly have me in Canberra. I think that's about just under 6 3/4 hours, and it would also well and truly have me in Adelaide. So that's only an itty bitty part of Australia. So definitely distance-wise, we are very similar to the US as opposed to the UK. And when you look at size, if you leave out Alaska, then Australia is pretty much the same size as the USA. What I find interesting when he's talking about 7 hours, if you go coast to coast in the UK, 7 hours, that's going to put you in the ocean. If I were to compare that to Tasmania, same thing. Driving from Hobart to Burnie, for example, you'd be in the ocean long before 7 hours. Coast to coast, I've actually never thought about that, but probably even less time, because if you look at a map of Tasmania, then obviously it is less wide than it is long.
What happens with that is that once you move to the United States, even having grown up in Britain, your perspective of distance changes. You see, it used to be that when I was a kid, we'd drive from Grimsby, my hometown, down to the southwest coast, and it took a few hours. We thought that was an eternity, because in British terms, that is. Remember, we're a country that's the size of Wyoming. But what struck me on this road trip recently is that I didn't really consider it that long at all. I mean, granted, I am now in my 40s, so my lower back felt it, but my brain didn't. You know, it was as if this was a normal thing to do.
Definitely, I find if I'm on a longer trip, I need to get out and stretch a bit and loosen up my neck a bit. But he's right, you do become accustomed to the greater distances. I must admit, I've got a bit less accustomed since moving to Bendigo, because in Bendigo everything is only 5 minutes away. And so a drive down to Melbourne is about 2.5 hours depending on traffic. So that's kind of more the standard for me these days, rather than like a big 5 hour trip or 7 hour trip or whatever. But, you know, I would think nothing before of heading over to Lakes Entrance for a weekend, which is a 5.5 hour drive to get there. So yeah, he's got a point.
Of course, there's one thing that I think probably helps Americans get used to the idea of driving a bit further than we might in Britain, and that's the size of our vehicles. I may have mentioned it before, but not only is the country much bigger than the United Kingdom, but so are the cars. Not for us, we have a Prius. But you will see on American roads plenty of either trucks, which is great for transporting stuff, or those minivans. Now, that's not to say that we don't have either of those two things in Britain. They're just not as widely embraced as they are here. I've experienced this. I've travelled again to West Virginia years ago in a minivan because we had multiple people coming with us, and honestly it was hell now that I think about it, because there were too many people. We'd overestimated the space. But I could see a situation in where the minivan would be great. I'd have the whole 3 back seats to myself, and then everybody else has to squeeze together in front of me, because that's just who I like my personal space. America gives me that, just not in a Prius.
I guess it depends on how many people you're trying to squeeze into that Prius. My sister owned a Prius, and when she had it, we did plenty of trips around different places in Victoria. And, you know, I used to have a little Hyundai i20, and that was the car that I had when I did my road trip from Bendigo across to Lakes Entrance and all the way up the coast to Byron Bay. And I was more than happy doing a road trip in a little car. But then that was just me and the dog, so obviously space wasn't really a huge issue. As far as Australians road tripping and car size, I think it's probably a mix of a mix, isn't it, really? I mean, it depends what sort of vehicle you own. We certainly don't own as many of those big American tanks. And these days, I think it is far more affordable to go road tripping if you have a smaller vehicle. Um, so I guess it comes down to, in Australia, I guess we are probably a little bit more economical vehicle-wise than the US, probably closer to the UK. But at the same time, we probably do have a few more bigger vehicles than the UK. Let me know what you think about that.
In Britain, we're all about smaller vehicles. I think when I was a kid, we had a Fiat Uno, tiny hatchback, and I remember we drove fairly long distances in that. Of course, I was a child. I did silly things like, lift my legs up onto the seat, or put them across my brother, or in my mum's face. And I was smaller, so it was easier. I mean, this is doing a disservice to our larger vehicles, but the point is, pound for pound, you don't have quite as much space in British cars. So it's a good job we don't drive as far.
I don't know, I've never really considered the size of the vehicle when it comes to road trips. You know, I've made plenty of trips from here across to Ballarat, which is a couple of hours, with several of us in the car, and that's in a hatchback. Likewise, you know, trip to Canberra, 2 of us in the car, hatchback. Aborted road trip to Sydney, 3 of us in the car until I got the train back because we had really bad bushfires and I couldn't breathe, so I had to go back to Melbourne and then back to Bendigo. But that's for another day. But at the same time, I did do one road trip with an older Tarago, and that was actually quite enjoyable. That was heading from Bendigo down to Melbourne and then across to Lakes Entrance with 3 of us in the car, and it was kind of comfortable. So I can see the comfort in having a slightly larger vehicle, but at the same time, I think it comes down to what you're used to, doesn't it?
But another thing that helps put into perspective the long distances that we may or may not be travelling is how we pass the time. I've noticed that it is a common feature of road tripping in either country to play a game. It's just that the game in question may well differ. Take, for example, Road Trip Bingo. Played in both countries, this is where passengers whip out a bingo card and check off the things they see. Whoever completes their card first wins. However, it's become clear that the items on a US bingo card don't always match those on a British one. And that's because the scenery and the things that occupy it differ somewhat on either side of the pond.
Okay, so I don't know if we have any of these bingo cards in Australia. Probably can get them these days. But I have to say, back when I was a kid and we were road tripping, we didn't need bingo cards for our games. We were quite capable of creating our games on our own without the need for any props. But let me know, have you come across bingo cards in Australia? I've certainly heard of road trip bingo, but I'm just curious if you do have bingo cards in Australia or if it's just an overseas thing.
For example, the UK's sheep population is around 7 times greater than that of the US, meaning it's literally impossible to have a road trip in the UK without seeing them a lot. Then again, unless you're driving through the 4 states that have banned it, the same thing might be true in the US when it comes to billboards.
One thing I've noticed in terms of the difference between Tassie and Victoria is that in Victoria, I mean, obviously in Victoria, when you're on the freeway, you're not going to see livestock. But in Victoria, you can drive the back roads, the country roads, and you're not going to see a fraction of the amount of livestock in paddocks off to the side of the road as what you would see in Tasmania. You can't go anywhere in Tasmania without just seeing paddock after paddock of sheep. And depending where you go, you're probably going to see cows as well and horses. Victoria, it's really far less common to see livestock off on the side of the road. I don't know if that's because the rural properties in Victoria, maybe they're bigger. Maybe people have their stock further away from the highways in Victoria. I'm not sure, but you certainly don't see the same volume of livestock if you're travelling country roads in Victoria.
I became aware of a game growing up called Spotto, and this is where you basically look out for a yellow car and then the person who sees it says Spotto. But after I moved to the US and I was driving around with my wife, she brought to my attention something I'd never heard of called pediddle. And believe it or not, that's not something that you do at a rest stop. This is another game. You and others are on the lookout for a car whose headlight is out, and when you see that, you're supposed to say pediddle and hit the roof, apparently, in order to determine who it was who said it first.
So I actually don't recall ever playing Spotto as a kid. So I don't know if that's something that came to Australia later on. Although, given the number of British imports that we have in Australia, I'm sure it must be something that's been in existence here in Australia right through. Maybe it's just my family never did it. With us, it was always looking out for beetle bugs. We didn't call them punch bugs because we wouldn't have punched each other in my family. That's just the way we were. I think if I'd have punched my sister, I would have been thrown out of the car. Um, but yeah, we used to look out for beetle bugs and minis. So for us, road trips, the cars that you were looking out for were beetle bugs and minis. But it was more a case of you just, if you saw it and you were the first one, you yelled it out. No physical violence involved.
And another pastime specific to the US is the license plate game. This is where passengers observe traffic for the license plates of different states, the ultimate goal being to tally up plates from all 50 states. No equivalent for this exists in the UK, where real license plates, regardless of region, are plain old yellow. Spotto.
Well, I can tell you now, growing up in Tasmania, that's not something that we ever did. Especially when you consider that until you got the Spirit of Tasmania boats coming in, a lot of people just did not travel on the ferries to Tasmania because they were a rather hideous ride. So it is far more popular these days to take your car on a holiday to Tasmania than it was when I was growing up. So for us, road tripping in Tasmania, it would have been a rarity to see a plate from any other state, and you certainly wouldn't be able to collect plates like that. I'd love to hear from someone who's grown up in a mainland state. Is that something that you used to do growing up? Or is it just something that is very specifically an American road trip thing? I must admit, when I was doing my road trip up the east coast, I was looking out for states, plates from different states, but not so much as a game, just so much of a how many different plates am I going to see on this road trip.
Said we do have a different number plate game in which we might look out for number plates containing, say, a certain letter or number. But
Yeah, we used to play an alphabet game. So, and you could count number plates in that, but it was not just number plates, it was signs as well. Of course, my devious trick when we were growing up was if we were playing the alphabet game coming back from a long trip, the corner shop just before our house, the name of the corner shop had a Z in it. So, in terms of who got to travel in the front seat and who got to travel in the back seat, meaning who was on what side of the car, I would basically figure it out so that I knew that when we got back home, or pretty much back home, I would be on the right side of the car to be able to call out the letter Z and win the game. And that worked for me quite a few times.
the biggest thing that I've noticed is that Americans are far more likely to break out into song. I thought this was a trope of the films because it happens in National Lampoon's Vacation and many others until I got into a car with my wife's family. In Britain, I'm not saying we don't ever do that, but I think most of us are probably a bit self-conscious about the way we sing, and so that doesn't happen as often. And if it does, we'd have to be drunk, and if we're drunk, we shouldn't be using a motor vehicle.
So, coming from a musical family, it's always been a tradition in our family that you sing when you're on a trip. And even more than that, for me, since the day I could talk pretty much, I used to sing in the car everywhere. So, even as a little toddler, would be going somewhere and I'd be singing in the car apparently. So, I wonder if it's just his family because there would have to be families in the UK who sing in the car. And like I said, it's certainly a normal thing in my family.
What I'm saying is we reserve the singing for weddings. Now, it's one thing that Google Maps will tell me, ooh, look, it's 9 hours to travel from here to there. But what that doesn't take into account is the fact that you're going to have to stop a lot, especially since we have a dog with us. So along the way, we got out at what Americans know as rest stops. And a lot of the time, rest stops in the United States are sort of small buildings that usually house some bathrooms, as well as pamphlets displaying places to go in the local area. Occasionally, of course, you do find those larger rest stops that have a full-on food court and things like that. They exist as well. In Britain, there are one or two major differences when it comes to these outlets. Firstly, they're not called rest stops. They're known as motorway service areas, and these are usually the big kind of rest stops. You have your food courts, you have your toilets. You also have a lot more parking space. Partly that's going to be down to the fact that even though we're about the size of Wyoming, we have nearly twice the population of California. And this might also account for the fact that your parking spot within this car park is usually timed. But it's also down to the fact that ample space is afforded to trucks, often known as lorries in Britain. It should be noted that the US concept of truck stops, in other words, stops used exclusively by trucks, are not nearly as common in the UK.
Okay, so what I've come across in Australia, only amongst 3 states obviously, is that it is very different between the 3 states. And it is a little bit probably closer to the American model here in Victoria, where you have service centres, which are your fuel stop, and then there's a few takeaway stores as well. And of course, inside the servo part, you can buy hot food or drinks or, the standard servo stuff that you buy. And the service centres here in Victoria have a massive area around the back, which is basically your truck stops. So that's where a lot of truckers will stop overnight if they're travelling long hauls. I noticed that in New South Wales there are far fewer service centres, and they're not anything like the ones in Victoria. They don't compare at all. So Victoria definitely does it better than New South Wales. In terms of truck stops, then I think New South Wales, a lot of the truck stops are just spots on the side of the road where you pull in to like a slip lane. And of course, all the way up the freeways, highways, etc. Um, in Victoria and New South Wales, you have those little smelly, disgusting toilets that are at the rest stops, the truck stops on the side of the road. Um, Neither New South Wales or Victoria do it as well as Tassie. In Tassie, if you want to pull over and have a break, there's usually a really nice park somewhere where you can stop and you can just wander around the park, and then the toilets are usually there as well. So you can get right away from the highway. You're not just stopping off at the side of the highway. You know, chances are there's going to be like picnic benches, there may be a barbecue in some areas. Um, I mean, Campbelltown, classic example. You can head off to the side and there's a beautiful park off the side of the highway there, or if you familiar enough with the back streets, you can go round to King Street, and that's a nice big oval area where you can get your dogs out of the car and give them a bit of a run, and it's way off the highway. Um, I have no idea what it's like in other states, so I would like to know from people in other states what your sort of service centres or road stops or whatever you call them are like.
The other thing to note here is that at British rest stops, there's usually a hotel attached to it in case you need to stay there overnight. You don't typically find this at American rest stops because most towns or cities have a complex of hotels somewhere in its vicinity.
Yeah, we have that separation here in Australia, really. I mean, you know, it's a service centre or a roadhouse. It's where you stop partway through the trip, but you're not planning on staying overnight. You just stop, grab more fuel if you need it, grab some snacks, whatever, make a pit stop, and then keep moving. So I guess because I guess in Australia there are so many little towns and places in between that you really don't need hotels attached to service centres, because even if you're doing like a 15-hour trip, there's still somewhere halfway where you can book to stay overnight and you don't need to stay in a service centre.
Britain also has hotels, the likes of Travelodge and Premier Inn, and I'm not going to spend this time boring you with the differences between British and American hotels because I did that in a previous video. But what I am going to say is that there's a cheaper alternative in the United States that a lot of road trippers capitalise on, and that alternative is motels. Motels did originate in the United States as a portmanteau of motor hotels, and they are bog standard, about the term I would use for every motel that I've ever stayed in. There's no swimming pool, there's no jacuzzi or hot tub or anything like that. It's basically just a room, and then you've got the manager's office. It's like in Psycho. We've all seen the Bates Motel. Most motels feel like that. I've never been murdered, as proven by the fact that I'm still doing this video, but I have felt like there's somebody in the room with me, and it's usually my wife, and everything's fine.
So is he saying they don't have motels in the UK? Because, wow, I just thought it was kind of a universal thing. I mean, you've got motels everywhere here. Another thing he doesn't mention is like holiday parks with cabins. So is that just an Australian thing? Because, you know, that's your other affordable option. Although I have noticed that these days there seems to be a bit of an imbalance, and cabins have now become slightly more expensive than some motels, which seems a bit crazy.
From the British side of things, I have two things to say here. Firstly, because we don't travel such great distances, there might be an argument that we don't really need to stop off anywhere en route to where we're actually ending up. So a lot of the time we don't end up making that sort of overnight stay in the middle of our journey. But if we were to do it, in my experience, we used to just check into one of those Premier Inn hotels or a travel lodge. Now, I'm not entirely sure if that's normal among all Brits who travel, or if it's just another indication that my family is really middle class.
So if I look back to when I was growing up, the only times I ever stayed in hotels was if I was touring with Rosny Choir, and most of the time we were billeted in families. But there were occasions when that wasn't viable, and so we were put in a hotel and, several kids to a room, and we'd just act up completely crazy. Motels, stayed in a few motels with family over the years growing up, but definitely not hotels, nothing fancy. But mostly, if we were road tripping, we left home and we reached our destination in one day. So, and usually that was going to spend time with family or going camping. So I think that's where things are very different, I guess. Or at least in Tasmania it was. I'd love to hear people's perspectives from various states other than Tasmania. In terms of my road trip, I never once stayed at a hotel. I stayed in cabins. I booked campsites because I also took my tent with me. And there were actually one or two nights when I slept in the car, having mistimed things or just gotten too tired to really give a rat's ass. And so I ended up stopping at a truck stop where I knew it would be nice and safe, and I had the dogs with me anyway, and I slept in the car. But yeah, never spent money on hotels when I've been travelling. And other times when I've been places, I've booked into like Airbnbs. And I did do that on my road trip as well. I forgot that. But yeah, maybe it's just a different culture here in Australia, because the people that I know tend to go for Airbnbs, cabin accommodation, or you're heading somewhere because you're going to stay with relatives. Let me know your perspective on that. So, this was interesting. I think it was interesting to see the similarities between both countries and Australia and the differences. But at the same time, I question in terms of how much of that just goes back to what I grew up with in Tasmania, being a somewhat insular state, as opposed to what others may have grown up with in other states in Australia. So please do leave comments below and tell me about your road trips when you were growing up. So thanks for listening. Please hit the like button. If you're new to my channel, please do subscribe and definitely leave a comment below. And I'll catch you in the next one.